we'll have people waiting for us. Good, I think. Right. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. We are just waiting for other people. Well, currently it's just us at the moment. So we will give it a few moments. Hey, we got more people. Cool. Slight change to the previously advertised participants. We have got author and blogger and sometime podcaster Josh Proven joining us because I'm afraid that Jennifer Dasal has got a very nasty bout of
the dreaded lurgy.
The dreaded COVID. Yes, yeah, it's it's still around. It hasn't been fixed after all, and yeah, we've got to stay safe. Sorry, and one of our fellow panelists is having trouble logging in, so I'm just sending him a message. Right. So let's kick this off. So what we're going to do is have each of our presenters. So the roundtable is focused on podcasters to authors. And in the case of Josh, it's slightly more the other way around. But we're trying to sort of explore this crossing between these two different sort of formats. And what we will start with is a very short presentation of your books. So maybe let's start with Jenny and Genn to talk about your book.
Yeah, so we have a book called Women of Myth, which is coming out February 2023, and it is a book about women in mythology from all around the world. And it's really fun to write, really fun to do all the research for this. It's divided into 3 categories: women, women. They're all women. Well, women,
heroines, and monsters.
Thanks, Jen.
Although monsters is very much open for debate, and we look at that too in the book of how we view monsters and how they reflect cultures and outside people looking at cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an illustrated book. It is got our illustrator is named Sarah Richards, and she's just incredible. The artwork just blew my mind when we saw it.
Absolutely.
It's just been such a joy. I mean, we primarily do a lot of history on our podcast. We do some mythology, but this was a bit of a detour for us, and it allowed us to get really into different cultures that we haven't been able to cover yet on the podcast because of the way we do our work and how granular it is.
Yeah, and one of the things that we were looking at that we really cared about with this project, because it was so diverse in terms of the cultures that we were exploring and the mythologies that we were learning about, was that we really wanted to make sure that we had a diversity of representation of beauty standards, and also a diversity of representation in terms of women versus femme characters, who were maybe outside of the gender binary of like all cis women. So we found some really interesting and fun characters, and we're really excited to share that with everybody.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Josh, how about yours? So you've written a number of books, I think, already, and that have been published. Tell us what you've got available.
Yes, I have. I'm also in the non-fiction family here. I wrote my first book, which was published in just as we went into lockdown. Actually, I was writing it in 2017, called Wild East: The British in Japan, 1854-1868, which is a little, which does, I hope, what it says on the tin. And that goes through the diplomatic and military events of the first interactions between Britain and the then shogunate of Japan. So this is pre the Empire of Japan, and recently, just last year actually, I published with Helion and Company, Bullock's Grey and Good Madeira, which is a narrative of the Maratha and Jat campaigns, which were conducted by the East India Company during the early 1800s against some of the Indian powers, who were then challenging them for dominance of the subcontinent. So that's what I have out at the second. I'm currently writing a third book, which is about the Spanish in the American Revolution.
Excellent. Cool. So, well, this conference is all about crossings. And how different do you find it writing a podcast script from writing a book manuscript?
This is for me? For everybody?
For everybody. It's a general discussion.
Well, I will defer to the ladies to go take their first turn.
What do you think, Genn?
This is a really different experience for us because our scripts, our podcast, which doesn't always sound like it's scripted, is pretty heavily scripted. And those scripts are really sort of research heavy and they go on a variety of different topics. But this particular book that we did, unlike other projects that we're hoping to do in the future, had a very specific format. We had to have a certain amount about background of the goddess and the people and different facts and stuff like that. So it was very stringent in how it had to work.
Disciplined, I would say.
Yeah. Whereas our podcasts, sometimes we decide we're going to write about Spartacus, and that should just be like a 2-episode 2-parter, and it becomes a 4-parter with 2 episodes on Thracian culture and then 3 episodes on Dionysus. So like we kind of get to do whatever we want in our podcast.
10 episodes on other aspects of Spartacus and expert interviews and everything. Like we're very used to going down rabbit holes and really indulging ourselves and like really just kind of getting into every single nook and cranny of whatever it is we're researching. And with this book, I think it was a valuable exercise for us because we really did have to focus, and we had to exert discipline in terms of not wandering down every single little research rabbit hole that we found, because we had a limited word count for everything that we did. But on the other hand, the focus was also a lot broader than what we're used to. Like we're used to focusing very heavily on one aspect of history and just going super, super deep. And with this one, we went wide. And that was really fun because we got to explore regions of the world and times and places in history and culture that we have not covered on the podcast, which for us was really fun. And I know I've been itching to do that. So
yeah, same. And it was just a good experience of, instead of writing a 5,000 to 12,000 word script about one thing, actually hitting your word counts and making sure everything was as tight and well constructed as it could be.
It turns out we can hit word count like deadly.
Like
we can limit our word count when required to.
Most people have the other problem.
How about you, Josh? What do you find?
I find that the difference is interesting in terms of when you write a book, you're writing for basically somebody's mind, essentially. You can pack a lot of things in there that don't work when you have to say it out loud, basically. If you're writing, in my case, I do a lot of guest appearances and things like that, or long-running appearances on podcasts and things like that. You tend to find that you'll write it out, what you want to put in. Sometimes you'll script it more than others, depending on how well you know the subject. But some things just don't work if you have to read it out. Sometimes you like to write a little flowery, if you're writing it for a book, you want to describe something very well, but it sounds weird if you spend 5 minutes talking about the scenery at the place you're talking about. Footnotes is another thing, you have to verbalize where you get your information from for the people, instead of you put it at the bottom of the page, you put it in a bibliography. So you'll have to say at the end of whatever you've just said, if you need to qualify it, and you can see this in et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just things like that. It's a lot in my limited experience, to do with the presentation of facts, and how you package them is really where it's at. There's the sort of the crossing point between the two, and how they are different on either side of the river.
Cool. Yeah, so let's start with you on this then, Josh. I found when I was listening to, reading Mike Duncan's book, that I was ending up reading it in his voice. And so do you think that I ended up listening to it as an audiobook. do you think you have a different voice when you're writing? Because you're writing quite academic books from when you're on a podcast.
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I've ever put a lot of thought into the sort of the author's voice, although it's obviously a large topic in terms of writing. I don't know if I notice any difference. And I suppose I would have to ask people who've read my book and listen to me on podcasts if I have a distinctive sort of audible and textual voice. I feel like, as I said before, you do find yourself tailoring things, tweaking things very slightly towards what you're doing. So if it's a podcast where you'll choose your words differently, I guess. And I guess since those words come from me, I suppose there must be a theme running through everything one does. And certainly I can notice in text when someone I know or have read a lot of is writing, and I'll often, a little smile will come to my face when I hear them talk, and I say, you write like you talk. And I do love it when that happens.
Cool. Jenny and Genn, what about you and your voice, your authorial voice?
I think it's a bit different for us because our podcast is a 2-person show, So we are, whenever we're doing our podcast, it is scripted, but also we kind of go off piste a lot and we talk about things and we joke around, and then I will edit everything down and keep some sort of wandery off conversations and not keep others because they're a little bit off topic. But it's kind of a combination of a writing exercise and a performance, what we do on the podcast, whereas in the book it's just the writing. So
Yeah.
Excellent. And okay, sorry.
What do you think, Genn? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things with the book and with our podcast voices, again, as Jenny said, we are very much two people talking, and it is sort of building off of each other and our friendship. With both the book and the podcast scripts, one of the things we had to learn really quickly was how to write scripts so that it didn't read as if two different people were writing different scripts. So we very much have had to adapt, and it's the same in the book because we each wrote half the book. We've had to adapt so that our voices aren't the same, but it doesn't read sort of like as if it's two different people writing a book.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. And cool. So this is something about whether books are more solid, or so there's something, are they considered sort of more real than podcasts? They've been sitting around. We respect books more. So do you think that podcasts are somehow more ephemeral than a good old printed book? Josh?
Well, that's, again, knocking it out of the park with questions here. I had wondered about this, and I think it for me, it sort of turns back to what I was saying about footnotes and how you present the facts, and especially in nonfiction. I think there is a sort of ephemeral view of podcasts because there's the idea that once you've said it, it no longer exists anymore, particularly. I mean, it's still in an archive. You can still listen to it again. But when people quote a podcast, and people do, it's a whole different academic rule. You have to timestamp it. You have to say the day it was retrieved. You have to do all these different things if you want to actually quote a podcast or an audible book. Some people quote actual spoken word of a book. And I was thinking that certainly through the last 2 or 3 years, since everybody's been sort of moving towards podcasts, that nonfiction podcasts have attained a level of respect they didn't have maybe before. So I think maybe things are changing.
Cool. And Jenny and Genn, what do you think on this?
It's good to hear on the academic side that it's changing, because a lot of history podcasts in general are, or at least ours, we do our best to be as well researched as possible. We put in a lot of time. So the idea that they are becoming more used as a source and respected is good. I would say with all things, and this is true of books as well as podcasts, sometimes you have an episode that's 5 years old and maybe some of the stuff is out of date and you do have to go back and adjust it. I mean, I used to work in academic publishing years and years ago, and that's why you have new editions, right? So I think sometimes, you know, podcasts do get updated. Ours, thankfully, at the moment, that's not something we have to worry about. I don't know, it's really difficult. I find podcasts to be, they're not tangible. You can't hold them in your hands, but I don't know, Jenny, we can hold a lot of scripts in our hands. We should print them off one day.
People keep asking us for transcripts. I don't know. I mean, then it would not be non-ephemeral. I mean, I don't know. I think being an author and writing a book has a certain cachet because there are gatekeepers to that, you know, like in the traditional sense. You have to find an agent, you have to find a publisher, you have to you know, market it to an audience, and like people have to review it and accept it, and you know, like there's a lot that goes into a book that involves being validated by the existing, you know, I don't know, establishment in a certain way. I think that's true in different ways for fiction and nonfiction. In the traditional sense, I mean, I think that it's getting less like that with self-publishing. So you can write a book and publish a book and not sidestep that, which I think is, you know, in a lot of ways that there are things about that I think are great. You know, I plan to do that myself. And podcasting similarly, like there aren't barriers to entry like that. Like you can just put a podcast together and have the podcast, and you have it, and you don't necessarily need to please gatekeepers or have any credentials. Jen and I, neither one of us have a history degree. We're just super interested in this stuff, you know. But as time goes on, and as you build credibility, and as you build your audience as a podcast, you can gain that, you know, a certain amount of cachet that you might also gain by writing a book, perhaps faster, but then the publishing industry moves quite slowly anyway. So maybe it's a little bit equal there. It's hard to tell.
And also I would say like some success that, you know, the reason we got to write this particular book is that we were podcasters with the platform who were writing this area. And if we weren't doing that, I'm not sure that we would have been able to write this particular book. So for us, they're kind of a little bit linked together.
I think that's a good point as well, because I don't actually have a specialist history degree myself either. And I actually came here through blogging. So I established myself as writing stuff before I actually pitched anything to a publisher, and then went podcast. And there's no doubt about it, like you're saying, that podcasts are a popular thing, you know, the popular history. And that's great, because that's where a lot of people are now getting their history from. So I think that's a very positive thing.
Yeah, and I think it gives people an outlet, you know, like people who like me and Jen, you know, like a lot of us who are just so passionate about something. And it's just amazing to be able to talk about it and then maybe find an audience for that who wants to hear what we have to say, which is just incredible. And maybe earn a living, or at least a small amount of a living off of that. Like there are opportunities out there that, you know, and I think that's true with self-publishing too. I think that both of these things are like constantly changing, and their relationship to each other is changing, you know, so that's interesting.
And I think, sorry,
it's just quite a good moment to welcome Zach on board. I'm glad you made it, because I think this is one of my sort of next questions was about the whole sort of money thing, about what it means to self-publish versus working with a publisher. So Zach, just give us a 2-minute potted summary of your, well, now books. And then we can, I think that would be interesting to lead on into talking about, you know, what the business is like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I started originally like back in 2016, and basically my master's dissertation was published by a small press in America, and kept that relationship going. And then 2020 published a bigger book, and then springtime 2021, I just found self-publishing, and I was like, how did I not know about this? And I basically devoured everything I could about it for the next few months. Initially, I wanted to do nonfiction, but then midway through the summer of last year, kind of was like, why don't I write fiction? Because everyone was like all the groups I was in, because of course I joined all the groups, listened to all the podcasts and all that kind of thing. And it was all like, oh, audiobooks and all this kind of stuff. And I really wanted to transition to that. And then it just started to occur to me, do you know, I could actually write fiction. And yes, I have a lot to learn, of course. Then I thought like, I'll write something and it'll be great straight away. But it is so there's an awful big learning curve, as I've since come to learn. But yeah, since then, in September of last year, I released the first in my historical fiction series called Matchlock. Thought that it was wonderful and had very thin skin, and then basically went back to it, fixed it up, got rid of 23,000 words, added a glossary, all that jazz, and then just released the sequel the day before yesterday. So it's been a long learning process, but yeah, I've made reasonable money. The idea was to use the podcast, the history podcast I do called When Diplomacy Fails. I've been doing that for like 10 years in May just gone. So the idea was to use that as a platform. Interestingly, and we could talk about this more later if we want, the transition from history podcast listeners to historical fiction readers is about between a third and a quarter. So it's not at all automatic, which kind of burst my bubble. I don't know why I thought they just want to consume everything I made. But I've wised up a bit since then, and it's been a fantastic journey. It's a long series I have planned, but I also want to get into the podcast scripts that I have, huge back catalog, stuff that can be turned into books. I should say as well, I also bought back my rights from my publisher so that I could republish again what I've already done. So I'm looking forward to doing that. And yeah, it's been fantastic.
Oh, and so Josh, what about you? So you've been working with publishers. How's that gone? Is it money making, money spinning enterprise?
Yeah, at my level, it all depends on the publisher.
Yeah.
Basically, that's the long and short of it. First of all, Zach, it's lovely to meet you. We actually follow each other on Twitter, and I don't know why I haven't asked if I can be a guest, because you seem to do stuff I like. Anyway, yeah. So the first book, I don't know where to start. Maybe I should start by saying that, as I said before, I started from blogging. And I blogged because, like Jenny and Genn, I just loved history. I wanted to write fiction, and basically I just accumulated a lot of research and wanted a place to talk about it. So I did a blog, and then I thought I could write a book about the British in Japan because I found this niche thing that I could do, and I found a publisher. Now a lot of the smaller history publishers, and especially military history publishers, will take your pitches without an agent. You can pitch directly to the publisher, and that's what I did. Now, with the first publisher, I went at it with the basic idea, I'm going to get a book published, I probably won't make any money. And honestly, I haven't from that one. But it got me a book, and that gives you a certain credit. And it did sell, and people say they liked it, and that, to be honest, is all I ever wanted from that. Because, to be honest with you, most of the time it feels like I don't know what I'm doing. And then I got in with Helion and Company, and they're a very specialist military publisher. Again, they're on the small side, but they have excellent support for authors, and I have made some money off that. Not a lot, but you can put that back into what you're doing. So again, it kind of depends where you're at in the ladder. I mean, if obviously we'd all love a sort of a contract with Bantam or Little Brown or something like that, who can get you massive sort of distribution and big advances, but we all have to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Jenny and Genn, I know your book's not quite out yet, so what are your expectations? Because Genn, for everyone listening, Genn is a book publishing professional, so she probably got quite good insight onto this.
So as we said earlier, our book is an illustrated book. So being someone from publishing, I've got very realistic expectations about what will happen with that book. But it's a beautiful book. It's working with our publisher has been amazing because, number one, I wouldn't commission the illustrations we got. I wouldn't be able to afford to do it if I wasn't working with the publisher. It's been a really good process. It was a very quick process. Jenny, you want to talk a little bit about the writing process of this book? Because it was wild, even for what I know about publishing.
It was very fast turnaround. And you were asking about, the money aspect and how this fits into our careers and what our expectations are. It's really hard for us to say, because like Genn said, it's not coming out for a while, and this is our first book. Both of our first book, I actually published a poetry chapbook maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, ages ago. And that did not make any money. So that was my experience. And then the podcast happened. So Genn and I, we did get an advance for the book. We split it 50-50. And from there, I'm hoping that we'll get some royalties. I don't know how many royalties. I've got my fingers crossed, Genn might have more of a sense of what we can expect in that area.
So it is.
You're trying to build up a sort of multimedia empire, all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We ultimate plan is world domination. So
we're not going to start small and keep going. I mean, both Jenny and I write fiction. We are also interested in writing more nonfiction. That's not necessarily illustrated, more like popular nonfiction. Because
like popular history stuff that's a little bit more in depth. We also have another idea for another illustrated book that we're thinking of maybe pitching after this one. We'll see how it goes, Yeah.
So our book is out with Simon & Schuster. So we are lucky in the fact that they handled the distribution. They handled all the editing. They commissioned the artwork. We, as first-time authors, were incredibly lucky to be able to have any say in what the artwork was going to be. Because of the nature of the book. When you're writing about women in world mythology and you're going across the diversity of cultures, one word that comes up all the time, which I find very offensive, is beautiful. And that's shorthand for how we describe women. So we then had to go into what beauty would look like across different cultures, and what it would look like across different body shapes and people. Because if that's the shorthand that seems to be in all of the mythology that we were researching,
much of it, not necessarily everything, but much of it, that's like the first descriptor of a woman that you ever come across, is that she does all these other things, but number one thing is she is beautiful.
Helen of Troy.
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
So it was super important to me, and in particular, not being a very tiny person, to show lots of diversity of body, and not just as in larger people, but as in athletic people. And as Jenny said, there's femme people. There's, we wanted to make sure that we were representing everyone, particularly because we were able to have illustrations as well as words.
And we were supported in that,
super supported. And we were also super supported in that we had an authenticity reader, which was one of the things that we were really passionate about, because, we were talking across a bunch of cultures, and we wanted to make sure that we were having someone else from another culture have a look at it and make sure that we were being as thorough as we could be.
I think, though, bringing it back to like the money situation and the career situation and how this fits in, like Genn and I have ideas and plans for things that we can just self-publish. We have ideas for things that we would like to pitch to an agent to see if we can, do another popular history thing. We both have fiction novels in the works that we want to, leverage this platform to get out. We're kind of at the beginning of all that right now, but like we're really hoping that this book and the podcast will both help us kind of pivot towards being full-time authors as well as podcasters. So how realistic is that? I don't know. We're going to find out.
And I was going to say,
that's the dream.
Just speaking of fiction, so Zach, because you're crossing over from a very heavily researched, factual, historical podcast into fiction. Well, what's that like? Is it a very different type of research you need to do?
It is a very different experience. I mean, like between doing a history podcast or a historical fiction, I mean, it's convenient in the one sense because Matchlock is set, it's a historical fiction during the 30 Years' War. And currently, When Diplomacy Fails, my podcast is doing a 30 Years' War series at the moment. We're up to 1634. I just released an episode there because I was off for like a week or 4 weeks with COVID and moving house and all, so it's a bit messy. you see, it uses two very different parts of your brain as well, even like writing academically or writing research in that kind of way, and then going to writing creatively. It's like some people are able to have days where they do both on the same day. I just can't do that. My brain feels like it's being like pulled apart. It's kind of crazy, but interesting to see how your brain and your body works, because some people are able to do that. I'm just not. But I definitely find with history podcasting, the actual research you do, it's much more broad. It's, well, like, I mean, as broad as the 30 Years' War can be. It's a very niche topic. Not that many people talk about it or anything. And looking at 17th century warfare and all that kind of stuff, fascinating for me, and definitely a niche subject, but I try to present the broad strokes, the narrative of what happened. Whereas when you're looking at like historical fiction, you're very grounded, and it's very earthy, and you're looking at what things smell like, what they taste like, what they would have looked like, what it would actually have been like to experience the Battle of Stadtlohn in 1623, when normally I would just say this battle happened. In the actual historical fiction, I have to describe what it would have looked like, because Matthew Locke in Matchlock is living through it. So it's something you have to bring the reader to, and it's like show, don't tell. You're trying to show what it would have been like to live through, rather than just saying exactly what would have happened. Whereas, of course, with history podcasting, or with just writing academically, anyway, because I'm doing a history PhD at the same time, so there's an awful lot of wheels turning. And I definitely find, even doing history podcasting, it's not as intensive as doing a history PhD, which you would think that's obvious, but you can definitely lend between the two. There's a bit of overlap, whereas with kind of like historical fiction, even though it's set in the same era, because you're using a different side of your brain, at least I am, and you have to think much more creatively, it is a bit different. Having said that, obviously, anyone who's listened to my podcasts knows that I like to go on tangents and be kind of, shall we say, liberal with the direction of the the direction of the actual story. So I just see Benjamin there. I don't get to talk about trebuchets all that much, but I'd love to talk about a good trebuchet. Maybe I'll include that in Matchlock. Sorry, but Ben always talks about trebuchets, so it's a private joke. But yeah, it's yes, more trebuchets. Let's get them. Yeah, no, it's a different style, but having the PhD, the history podcast, and historical fiction, doing those three things, it's like, it's so much variety, and that's what I really, really like. So yeah, maybe in the future that history PhD will translate into lecturing again, like what I've already done. So maybe I'll always have those three there, is what I'm saying, or maybe they'll be just the two. But it's yeah, like I can balance them. Sometimes I would rather do one or the other, but it kind of depends on the mood I'm in.
Cool. Josh, so what about you? What sort of triggers your interest in any particular historical subject? Because I know that you're very interested in sort of Napoleonic Wars and stuff. So how do you end up writing a book about Brits in Japan? Because I don't think Napoleon went to Japan.
No, he didn't. He didn't go to Japan. Maybe he would have eventually if he hadn't been exiled to St. Helena. We'll see. But I mean, that's for the alternate history fiction people to mess around with. Yes, that is something that I think about a lot. Actually, why I think to myself, why are you here? Why have you gone down this road now? I describe myself as a notorious generalist. I cannot stay on one subject without a contract for more than 2 weeks, practically. All my friends make fun of me for it. And I don't know what it is exactly. I feel like it goes back to when I was a kid, and I would play games and soldiers and things like that. And every other week you'd say, I've played with those soldiers, now I want to play with the other ones and do those ones, so I'm still in a way, I suppose, playing games. Whatever interests me about a concept, something just out of the blue, I'll be walking down the street and I'll suddenly something will trigger something in my mind, and I'll go, I wonder what he thought about that. And down the rabbit hole we go, straight off the side of the ship.
I'm going to write a book about it.
Yeah, exactly. And before I know it, I'm pitching something that I know that in 2 months I will not have the same interest in, but locking myself in anyway. So that's my torture. I don't know.
Yes. And on the subject of sort of topics and stuff like that, so Jenny and Genn, you've divided your book up into goddesses, heroines, and monsters. Pick a favorite from each category.
That's so hard. I did a different interview where I was like, well, I guess they're just all my favorite. So I think it's hard because you just fall in love with each one as you write it. But
Cool.
I think one of my favorite goddesses was this one called Oya. She's a Yoruba warrior goddess with this. She's got an affinity for storms and wind and lightning and deluges and the Niger River with its 9 tributaries and the number 9 and business and cemeteries and lightning. And she's amazing. But I think what is the coolest thing about her is that she's a goddess of destruction, but she's a goddess of like positive destruction, like the destruction that comes before transformative change. And I feel like, I had so many friends, and of course I've been in this place too in my life, who hold on to things, like hold on to, old like relationships with people that they really should break up, or like, bad jobs that don't treat them well or whatever. And just like and I've done this myself, like you just hang on for years and years and years because you're afraid of change. And the idea that there's this goddess who could just sweep through and just blow it all away and leave you with a blank slate to create a new reality on, just really some of that might be my own fan fiction about her, but I just was very attracted to that.
Cool. How about you, Genn? Have you got one?
Oh, that is really, really hard. My all-time favorite heroine is Atalanta, but I'm going to shelve her and I'm going to talk for a minute about the Deer Woman, who is a Native American. In the book, we call her a monster, but she's not really a monster. She's sort of a protective spirit. In particular, she looks after women and children and protects them in a kind of siren-esque way from predatory men. And what I really enjoyed about this was digging into the culture, digging in for the reason for why this mythology may have come up, and looking at how we on the outside label things and what it actually means inside a culture. So yeah, she was fascinating.
This sort of stuff right here is the sort of stuff that would trigger me to go down some sort of rabbit hole. Okay, that's this stuff right here.
Welcome to our podcast.
Exactly.
Ancient history fan girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
Enabling your rabbit hole tendencies.
Exactly. I go from ancient to 1900. This is my problem. So that this is exactly the sort of thing that would get me thinking. Now, what would that look like?
Your next book.
You never know.
That was the great thing about this book, was there were different formulaic bits, and one of them was like kind of like we tended to find a historical fact about something. So like one minute you're talking about like the story of, you're talking about like the story of the history of like the Deer Woman, and then you have to come up with like a modern fact about it. So it's like, but where does that fit into modern culture, and how does that actually let us look at what's going on with indigenous people, indigenous women, and why is this an important character that we're talking about? And then you look at sort of like the crime statistics of what's going on, and it's like, well, this is why this is such an important person who's having at the moment a bit of a resurgence, or just a knowledge in popular culture. And I found that to be really fun to do, because we do love a rabbit hole.
Excellent. We'd better wrap up. Just so, when's your book available?
Our book is ours is coming out February 2023.
You can pre-order it now.
Yeah, it can be pre-ordered now.
Cool. And Zach, so you've got Matchlock 2's out now, and how many more are there to go?
Yeah, Matchlock and the Embassy is the first one, and Matchlock and the Rebel is out now, and you can find it everywhere, basically. It should even be in libraries if my distribution efforts have been successful. But yeah, if you even just search my name and Matchlock, it'll come up, to be honest.
And Josh, when's your next one? You've got a third one in the pipeline?
Yeah, third one in the pipeline. I have to deliver it in the, I think, mid to early next year. So I would assume you'll be seeing it towards the end of 23.
Excellent. So everyone take note of the names. Great stuff to come. That was great. Thank you very, very much. That was really enjoyable, really interesting. Glad you made it, Zach. Okay,
Me
cool.
too.
So nice to meet everybody.
Cheers. Cheers all. Thank you. Bye-bye.